Hello and welcome everybody, my name is Ziad and today we are going to see together a Symfony component called the Dependency Injection component, which is a component that will be responsible for injecting dependencies in your PHP project. But you might ask, what is dependency injection? And the answer would be dependency injection is providing the objects that an object needs instead of having it construct them itself. And by providing, we mean we can also say injecting, and by the objects that an object needs, we can also name that dependencies. So we are basically injecting dependencies to our object. That's why the concept is called dependency injection or injecting dependencies. There is three ways of injecting dependencies. The first one and the most used one is through a constructor, meaning that we are going to define our dependency in the constructor. The second one is through a setter, meaning that we are going to define the dependency in a setter. And the last one, which is the least used one, through a public attribute, meaning that our dependency will be defined as a public attribute, and then the dependency injection component will come and assign that dependency since it is public. Say that you have been tasked in a project to get the weather forecast. So you would be having a weather service that will be calling an HTTP service, and this HTTP service will be calling an external weather API by issuing some HTTP calls. So this is probably how your project would look like. So we would be having a weather service that is dependent on an HTTP service, and the code of this weather service without dependency injection will look like this. Inside the weather service, we'll be creating a new instance of HTTP service, meaning that the weather service has created its dependencies itself. And with dependency injection, we'll be having the weather service just declaring its dependencies in the constructor, and then the dependency injection component will come and set this value for us. I hope that the concept of dependency injection is a bit clear for you. And now let's go and see the Symfony component itself and how we can use it inside a project. So here I have a PHP project that will build upon the example that we have seen previously, which is getting the weather from an external weather API. To execute this project, we have simply to do php weather.php, and it will get us the weather forecast for the next 3 days. So let's go to weather.php to see how this project works basically. So the first step is to create a new container builder, which is a class inside the dependency injection component. And then we'll get a file loader that will load for us services.yaml. And if we see this services.yaml here in our project, we will see that it contains all the configuration needed to create the instances and the services. So the dependency injection component basically is going to look up this file over here and see how to create all the services needed. And finally, to get an instance of any service, in our case it's weather service, we have just to call container get and the fully qualified domain name of our service. So we are getting an instance of weather service. Notice that we are not creating any instance over here. We are just getting the instance from our container, and it's the container who knows how to do all the stuff for us. And finally, we can use this instance to get the weather and display this weather in a table format like we have just seen. So we are going to start from scratch, and I will walk you through step by step on how we have achieved this. And we are going to see two versions. The first version will be without services.yaml, so all the config will be within the weather.php, and then we are going to enhance that version and introduce the YAML component and the YAML config file to make our code more clear and more readable with this config file over here. So let's get started. Alright, so the first step would be to create a folder. Let's name it dependency injection component, for example. Then let's cd to this folder, and then we are going to require a bunch of Symfony components which are needed for this project. The first one would be the dependency injection, which is our main component. Then we are going to use YAML config to read the config file that the services.yaml file that we will have in the second version of our project, and then HTTP client to get the weather service, Symfony var dumper to dump some variables if we need it, and then finally the Symfony console to display a nice table when we get the weather. So let's require all these components, and then we let composer do the rest. Once done, we are going to open this project with any view. In my case, it's PHP Storm. Alright, so we have an empty project over here opened in PHP Storm. We have the vendor folder and composer, JSON and log files. If we go to composer JSON in the required section, we will find that we have all the dependencies that we have required using the composer command line. We are going to add a new section over here concerning autoload. It will be PSR4, and we are going to use src folder for app namespace. So app over here, which is the namespace, and it will be mapped to src folder. Alright, so the next step will be to create an src directory, and within this src you are going to create services directory, which will contain our two services, which are HTTP service and weather service. So let's create the first one, which is HTTP service, a new PHP class, and it's called HTTP service. Let's add the namespace over here, app services. This class over here will be a wrapper around HTTP client service. So we need an attribute of type HTTP client interface. Let's call it HTTP client over here. And then our code without dependency injection will look like this. In the construct, we are creating our instance ourselves. So this is the version of HTTP service without dependency injection, which is not the best way to do it. So let's remove this constructor over here and use instead, and declare instead that we need an instance of HTTP client interface, and then we will let the dependency injection component inject that for us. So this is the code of our constructor. If you are using PHP version 8, you can basically replace all this by just this. So in the constructor, we are defining a private read-only instance of HTTP client interface, which is called HTTP client. So here we are declaring to the dependency injection component that we need an instance of HTTP client interface, and it's up to him to provide us with that. The second function will be a request, which we'll call basically the request function of HTTP client. So nothing fancy over here. We are just forwarding the call of this HTTP service over here to our instance of HTTP client. The next step would be to create the weather service. So I'm going to create a new PHP class, call it weather service, and then our weather service will be depending on the HTTP service itself. So we are going to declare in the constructor that we need an instance of HTTP service along with two other parameters, which are days and temperature unit. So overall, our weather service class will need an instance of HTTP service, and then an integer, which will be the number of days to be considered in the forecast, and finally a temperature measurement unit that will be also needed to call the external weather API. To get the weather, we are going to define a function called getWeather, which will take latitude and longitude as parameters. Then it will use the HTTP service to do a request call to this external endpoint over here, and it will pass it some parameters. Among them, we find the latitude, longitude, and the number of days, and the temperature measurement unit. So we are going to basically do a call to our external forecast API through the HTTP service, and then we are going to return the result in an array format. So our services are ready to be used. Let's create now a weather.php file that will be using the dependency injection component to create those services and call the getWeather and display it in a table format. So in src, we are going to create a new PHP file. Let's call it weather.php. The first step would be to require Composer autoloader, because otherwise we won't be able to use any of Symfony's component downloaded by Composer. So we are going to require once vendor autoload.php. Then we are going to create our container, which will contain all the instances of our services, in our case HTTP service and weather service. So let's import this class over here, and if you notice that the container builder is already a class of Symfony component dependency injection, so we are starting to use this component. Now let's start registering our services. We will start with the first one, which is HTTP service. To register a service into the service container, we simply call register function. Then we will pass an ID over here, which is the first argument. An ID can be any string basically, but conventionally Symfony guys use the HTTP service class string, which is the fully qualified class name. And then the second argument, we are using the class itself. This is for registering the service, and our service, as we said, if we go to the definition of our service, it needs in the constructor an instance of HTTP client interface, and we are going to provide that with the factory method of HTTP client class HTTP client create. This static method will return us a concrete class of HTTP client interface. So here we have successfully registered our first service. Now let's go to the second one, which is weather service. If you go to the weather service and check the constructor, we will see that it needs an instance of HTTP service and then an integer value that will represent the number of the days for the forecast, and finally a string value for the temperature measurement unit. So let's register our service. In the same way we registered HTTP service, we are going to register our weather service. So we are going to call the register function on the container, and we are going to provide it with weather service class for both ID and class. Then we are going to need an instance of HTTP service, but since we know that our container will have an instance of HTTP service, why? Because we have registered that previously. We are going to provide as argument a reference to this instance instead of the instance itself. So we are creating a new reference and we are providing it with the ID, which is HTTP service class. The second and the third arguments are the number of days and the temperature measurement units, which we have hard-coded here. We can avoid hard-coding these values over here because we might need to use these values in other areas of our project, especially if we have a big project. So instead of hard-coding them, we can use an enhanced version by introducing the container parameters. So instead of putting 3 and 6s over here, we are going to define 2 parameters in our container, and then we are going to reference those parameters in the add argument function. So just before registering our weather service, we are going to introduce 2 parameters over here, which are weather days, the value would be 3, and then weather temperature unit, the value would be Celsius. And to reference those parameters, we have just to call add argument with special notation, which is the parameter name between percentage notation. Alright, so by now we have our 2 services, HTTP service and weather service, registered, and we can use them by simply getting them from this service container. To be able to get a service from service container, we simply have to call get on a container. So weather service will be equals container get, and then we have to provide the ID of the service, which is in our case the service fully qualified class name. So now we have an instance of weather service. We can now use it to get the weather by calling the getWeather method. So we'll be having response equals weather service getWeather, and we will provide a latitude and longitude for this method. Let's check our code by var dumping the response and see what we will get. So var dump response, and then we'll be executing in a command line within the src folder php weather.php. And yes, we are getting an output which is the weather forecast for the next 3 days of those latitude and longitude. So up to now our code is working great. We have just to display in a table format this forecast, and we will do that by using the table class within the console component. So I'm going to define a display forecast function that will take the response as parameter, and then we are going to use the table class that we have imported from Symfony component console helper to be able to display the weather forecast in a table format. I'm not going to go into details on how we parse the response and display it in a table format, because I have already a video that details that. I will be linking that in the description below. Alright, now let's test our code to see if we are going to get a nice table format in our weather forecast. We still have some dump somewhere, so we should remove that. But we do have a nice table displaying our weather forecast, so it's working, and our first phase of the project is achieved. Before moving to phase 2 or version 2 of our project, let's see a recap of version 1. So we had the weather service, which depends on HTTP service, and HTTP service, which depends on HTTP client. So mainly we had two services that have their dependencies, and then within weather.php we have defined a container, and then we registered our two services with all of their dependencies, and also we have set parameters needed for the weather service. This code over here of weather.php can be improved a lot, which is what we are going to do in version 2. So in version 2 we will still have the same services and their dependencies over here, but then within weather.php, instead of registering everything manually using PHP code, we are going to write two lines. The first one will be creating a YAML file loader instance, and then the second line will be loading a services.yaml file that will contain all the needed configuration for us. Services.yaml will contain basically the definition of parameters and also the definition of services. So the second version will be simpler in PHP and will be moving all the configuration into a human readable format in a services.yaml file. So let's go and implement this version. Alright, so back to our project, we are going to create our services.yaml file, which will be in config directory. So we are going to create a new file, config services.yaml, and within our services.yaml we are going to have this config over here. So we will have two sections, parameters and services. Parameters will hold our two parameters, which are the number of days needed for forecast, and then the temperature measurement unit. And then for services, we are going to have three services. The first one will be our HTTP client, which will be used by our HTTP service. So within HTTP service, we'll see that we are referencing an instance of HTTP client over here, and this instance is created with the factory method HTTP client create. Then our weather service will be referencing HTTP service, which we have just declared over here, and it will be using our two parameters, which are weather days and weather temperature unit. So this is the services.yaml, and now we are going to update our PHP code. So let's remove all of this code over here, which deals with registering our services and defining parameters, and then replace it with those two lines over here, which will be creating an instance of YAML file loader. Let's import this class, and then loading services.yaml. So those two lines will replace all the PHP code that we use to register the services and parameters, and now we should be okay to test our second version, our second simplified version. So in terminal we are going to execute php weather.php, and we should be seeing the same result that we saw in the first version, which is the weather forecast for the next 3 days. So let's test it, and yes, it is working. So we have enhanced our first version by introducing services.yaml file, where we will be defining all the parameters and services instead of writing that in weather.php, and replacing all the PHP code that will register services and parameters with those two lines over here.